So this is 5.4. This is the first half. Solving equations. Let's see what happens. So here we're trying to get x by itself. All we have to do is undo squaring, so we square root. So x equals, remember we have a plus or minus out in front, but it's the square root of negative 64, so that's no good. So we're going to pull out a square root of negative 1. So that's the negative square root of 1 times the square root of 64. Square root of 64 is 8, and the square root of, so that actually went right there. Square root of negative 1 is I. So plus or minus 8i. Number 2, before we can square root, we have to undo addition. So we're going to subtract 1, so we get x squared equals negative 1. Now to undo squaring, we square root. And so x equals plus or minus, remember the square root of negative 1 is I. Number 3, recall. We undo equations, the bottom operation up. So addition and subtraction first. However, this plus 5 is in the parentheses. So we need to undo adding 5 as part of the parentheses. X is also getting squared. So we actually have to undo the squaring first here by square rooting both sides of the equation. So squaring undoes, square rooting undoes squaring. In this case, we have x plus 5 equals, now let's break this apart. We have a plus or minus because we just square rooted. We have the square root of 36 times the square root of negative 1. So we get x plus 5 equals plus or minus 6, because the square root of 36 is 6, and the square root of negative 1 is I. Now we haven't solved for x yet, or we don't have x isolated. So let's subtract 5 to undo that positive 5. So we get x equals, now how am I going to write this? Well, I know this 5 is negative, so I'm going to write that down first. The 6i is positive or negative. So it should be written like that, negative 5 plus or minus 6i. And we can't simplify that anymore, folks, so that is our final answer. Boom. Last but not least, we'll subtract. If we talk through the process here, we have to undo subtracting 7. That plusing 7 is not, we have to undo adding 7. That adding 7 is not in parentheses, so it's going to the first thing that we'll undo. We have to undo multiplying by 5, and we have to undo squaring. So we're going to subtract 7. So we get 5x squared equals negative 40. We'll divide by 5 to undo multiplying by 5. So we get x squared equals negative 8. And then last but not least, undo squaring by square root. We do one side, do the other. So x equals, because we square rooted, plus or minus. I'm going to break this into the square root of 8 times the square root of negative 1. Square root of negative 1 is just I, but off to the side here, the square root of 8, I believe I can simplify more. Is there a perfect square that goes into 8? Yes, 4. So the square root of 8 is the same as the square root of 4 times the square root of 2. Square root of 4 is 2. That's why I looked for a perfect square to factor out, because I can square root perfect squares into an integer or a whole number. And so this, I'm not boxing that because that's the answer. That is equivalent to the square root of 8. So the square root of 8 is 2 roots of 2. In front of that, I have a plus or minus that I'm bringing down. And then don't forget about the square root of negative 1. That's just I. So there we are. Beautiful. I guess that can get rearranged. Right? We can put our you almost, when you're rewriting these things, folks, you almost think of I as like a variable, and so the variable should get attached to the integer. So there we are. Beautiful.